I'm sure you've heard of the Trans-Pacific Partnership at this point. It's the international trade agreement that Bernie was against and then Hillary was for, calling it the gold standard of trade before changing her mind and then coming out against it. And President Obama was always in favor of it, and now he says he's going to pass it during the lame duck session after the election. And Donald Trump, well, Donald Trump is against it, but he probably doesn't really know what it is. He said he's going to renegotiate it, though. And it's not surprising why so many people are confused by this, because the details of this trade agreement are very complicated. So let's try to make it as simple as possible. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a trade deal between Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the US, and Vietnam, with 6 other nations looking to join. And it's crazy because these nations together account for more than 40% of the world's trade. But in short, the TPP creates basic standards and rules governing trade that all member nations must abide by. And the TPP has the backing of many powerful corporations, as well as the corporatist politicians they financially support. And it would also require nations with previously closed economies to liberalize. And its provisions on labor organizing, for example, require nations to allow workers to unionize for more rights and better treatment. That sounds great. And the TPP will also create a network and a framework for expanding and enforcing existing international environmental protection agreements. Also, there are clear benefits to removing tariffs in general and other barriers that restrict global trade. The TPP would expand American trade opportunities with participating countries and lead to greater efficiency, lower costs, an increased variety for consumers, and a growth in the GDP. A growth that experts estimate could be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, with smaller and developing economies benefiting from this the most. Also, by raising regulatory rules and standards for many of China's key trading partners, the TPP would minimize China's capacity to manipulate global trade and deliver greater control to an international governing body, one that still gives greater power to multinational corporations rather than the individual nations themselves. Now, these advantages suggest that the TPP might be a good deal overall. I totally get that. But here's why it's potentially dangerous. Now, the biggest criticism lodged at the TPP is that it was negotiated in secret. Now that the negotiations are over, the agreement is available in its entirety. However, this wasn't the case during the crafting of this trade deal, where the only publicly available information was released through the leaks and suggested that the main beneficiaries of the new TPP rules will be, and you might have already guessed this, multinational corporations. While ordinary citizens and even most elected representatives had no idea what the fuck was going on with the TPP, multinational corporations enjoyed much greater access to the inner workings of the negotiation process. And that's pretty apparent when you look at the wording. Just one indication of corporate influence is the so-called investor-state dispute settlement process, which creates secret tribunals that hear lawsuits brought by corporations over legislation that cuts into projected corporate growth rates. In theory, this seems like a good idea because it protects foreign investment against possible unfair treatment in ordinary courts that may not appreciate foreign bodies coming in and trying to uphold some sort of sanction against the previously crafted legislation. But in practice, this will mean that, for example, like Budweiser could sue Vietnam for requiring that all beer sold in Vietnam include a health warning for pregnant women on the label, when in reality, no one should be drinking Budweiser, let alone pregnant women. And states offering public health care could face lawsuits from big pharma and insurance companies that claim that national healthcare systems restrict their investment opportunities. Now, the TPP essentially grants corporate interest veto power over sovereign nations' domestic economic policy. Or in the very least, they create a system where the corporations can demand substantial monetary compensation, as in the case of a trial going on right now with French multinational corporation Veolia after Egypt raised its minimum wage. And another worrying TPP provision involves patent and copyright restrictions that do not allow for genetic drug manufacturing, which will essentially grant big pharma monopolies, leading to higher healthcare costs in nations that desperately are in need of access to affordable healthcare. Drugs that seek to treat cancer and malaria or AIDS, among other diseases, will be less accessible to individuals. And lastly, something that you care about, the internet. The TPP's scary relationship with the controversial SOPA and PIPA Acts will impose copyright restrictions, allowing corporations to pursue all manners of copyright offenders, even those with no intentions of distribution. ISPs will be tasked with policing and shutting down any matter of copyright infringement, meaning that government and internet service providers can search, pursue, and impose heavy criminal sanctions on you for, let's say, like oversharing your favorite Game of Thrones episode, even if it's just with your friends, and even if HBO itself doesn't have an issue with it. And the vaguely worded clause on fair use will restrict free information distribution in unprecedented ways. So is the TPP really just about mapping out trade and tariff rules to promote economic growth for all participating nations? Or is it more about pushing this pro-corporate restriction backed by the United States onto all nations surrounding China in an effort to force the Chinese hand into abiding by US standards? Because it sure seems like all of these tariffs and regulations and environmental and labor protections seem like just the smokescreen for the true purpose of the TPP, which is basically to undermine national sovereignty and grant multinational corporations unfettered access to markets across the globe while simultaneously protecting those corporations' profits from any infringements imposed by the citizens of those nations. In other words, to inoculate corporate profits from the threat of democracy.